Jai Hind, Namaste, hello, and a very warm welcome to UPSC for everyone. My name is Abhinav, and in this video, we'll be discussing the Hindu and Indian Express for the date 6th of November 2020. Now, for your convenience, I have added timestamps in the description. So, if you want to skip to a particular news, please use those timestamps. And if you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos that we post. Also, if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. So, without wasting your time, let's get started. So, starting with the Hindu. Biden edges closer to victory as Trump mounts legal challenges. So, drama unfolding. Then all sectors looking up, says PM. So, PM was addressing a meet and there he said that all sectors of Indian economy are looking up. If you want, you can read this. Nothing substantial here. Then this one, Supreme Court reserves judgment in Central Vista case. So, if you remember, day before yesterday, we discussed about this, the deposition of the Solicitor General in the Supreme Court. So, what all did he say? The decision to make a new parliament was completely a policy decision, so Government of India should be allowed to do that. Then the new parliament building should come up at a central place only with a historical relevance. That is why they are making it there only. Then the present building was constructed in 1927. It has seating issues because it was constructed back then for legislative council but not for this bicameral house that we have. And in future we are going to expand parliament, right? After the delimitation exercises, right? That are going to happen. So we would need more seats. And even today when there are joint sessions or joint sittings, members have to sit on plastic chairs and that does not send out a right signal, right? Then this building is not also fire safety compliant. Then the water and sewer lines are haphazard and they are damaging the heritage structure. Many of the speakers, they have spoken about the need for a new building. Then there were also security concerns, especially in light of the 2001 parliament attack, right? Then they also said that cost considerations are also there. Center would save almost 1,000 crore rupees. How? All the departments and ministries would be in one place. So you won't have to travel here and there throughout the city to reach different departments. That would lead to saving fuel and time. That would also avoid traffic congestion. And this new building is with metro access. So it will also again save personal transportation costs. So this is what all center had said in the Supreme Court. Now let's see what the article is saying. So the government has defended its multi-crore redevelopment plan, saying the existing parliament building, which is nearly 100 years old, is under tremendous pressure and not a brick of the heritage structure will be touched while constructing the new parliament, central secretariat and various ministries. And if you remember, it is the Lok Sabha secretariat which has the ownership of the parliament, right? We discussed in that article. Redevelopment plan was a broad vision and on the practical side, it would save the public exchequer 1,000 crore in annual expenditure besides improving coordination among ministries, which would be housed in 10 buildings vantageously connected via metro rail. The petitioners have objected to the proposed change in land usage of Central Vista, the historical boulevard of approximately 3.5 kilometers from Rashtrapati Bhavan to India Gate and further to National Stadium, which is a symbol of India's historic past, its nationhood, its vibrant democracy. So these are the objections. But then again, government has said that this empty space, leaving it empty, is again a waste, and the new building has to come in this complex only because of its historical importance and also its central location. Then this one, agitating farmers block roads in 18 states. So farmers are agitating against the farm bills. So now this is happening. We'll discuss this once it gets something big, right? Then to page 6, you don't need to read this. If you want, just for gossip, you could read this. Then Vienna's woes. So this is about the attack on Vienna. So some points. The immediate question the Austrian authorities face would be about the failure of preventing the attack. Now they should go for introspection that how did this attack happen, because Europe was on high alert. So how did it happen, right? Then the larger challenge is to address the issue of radicalization among youth and counter attempts to disrupt the social cohesion of the continent. Now the chancellor, he gave a very balanced stand, right? He called for unity to fight against terrorism, and he said that this is not a fight between Christians and Muslims or Austrians and immigrants, but between civilization and barbarity. So very good statement and very balanced and sensible statement. Now when he first came to power, he was in alliance with some far-right Freedom Party, right? Now he is in alliance with Green Party. He has more political leeway to build stronger national response to terrorism. Now he's making some important points that jihadists use violence to create social discord while they unleash violence on public in the name of Islam. The rising Islamophobic nationalist parties in Europe sees on such incidents to bolster their fortunes. France's Marie Le Pen, with an eye on 2022 presidential election, has called for a ban on immigrants from some Muslim countries and declared a war to evict Islamism by force from our country. So you see, these terrorists, they bring shame to a community, right? Their acts are detrimental to the interests of the community because they are also human beings. Everybody is a human being. We all have our rights, right? But they carry attacks in the name of Islam. First of all, they denigrate the name of Islam, right? In the name of Allah, they do all of these things, which is not good for the Muslim community. Now that evokes a reaction, more so political reaction, and then this all happens. So this is a vicious circle, right? So there is a need for reform within the community as well, and there is a very big need to check this radicalism and radicalization. Now this one, the forgotten fact of China occupied Kashmir. Very, 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 very good editorial. This tells us about how in the common parlance we talk about POK, but nobody really talks about COK, that is China occupied Kashmir. I've shown you time and again how Aksai Chin, right? Around 38,000 square kilometers of land in Aksai Chin and around 5,200 square kilometers of land in the Shaksgam Valley, China is occupying, right? I've shown you that map. I'll show you again how in 1963, Pakistan ceded Shaksgam Valley to China. And today we'll also understand how China extended its claim over this territory, right? So let us begin. So first of all, my favorite map, again coming back to it. See, this is Aksai Chin, right? China is occupying it around 32,000 square kilometers. And an important road, the China National Highway 219 is running through it, which is connecting Xinjiang to Tibet, right? And this is the Shaksgam Valley, which is around 7,000 square kilometers illegally ceded by Pakistan to China in 1963, right? So these are the two areas which should be called COK, China occupied Kashmir. Now we'll see how this map initially of Kashmir was very, very big and how China expanded its claim. Initially, its land borders or frontiers were up till Kunlun Mountains. I'll show everything to you. And then they expanded it to Karakoram, way into the Indian territory, right? So this editorial is telling us about whole history, right? So first let us see some parts and then we'll go to the maps. So first it tells us, we discussed yesterday as well, that China is not saying anything about Pakistan's move to convert Gilgit-Baltistan into a province. But when India made its move on abrogating Article 370, China reacted very strongly, especially with respect to the UT of Ladakh, because it deems that it is one of the first steps of India towards reclaiming Aksai Chin, right? So China occupies around 5,180 square kilometers in Shaksgam and 38,000 in Aksai. Now CPEC is running through Gilgit-Baltistan, I've shown you, and China Highway 219. It ignores Pak's actions but questions UT of Ladakh, and I've told you why. The Shaksgam Valley in the Trans-Karakoram tract, part of POK, was handed on a platter by Pakistan to China through an illegal border agreement on March 2nd, 1963. Now the history how China extended its claim over the region. First, let me show you a map. Now see, this was the original JNK that was with the ruler of Kashmir, right? This whole region. Again, pay attention. This whole region was with the ruler of Kashmir. Then China slowly started making its claims. It started occupying these areas. Then finally, the agreement was that this area we got, right? Then this area, the whole Shaksgam Valley, was ceded by Pakistan to China. So this was original map. Then Pakistan ceded this region to China, right? See, initially, this was the natural frontier, the Kunlun mountain ranges. These were the natural frontier of Chinese borders, even as per their historical records. But you know that they have a habit of fudging their history, and even today we'll get to know that. Then they started extending their claims up to the Karakoram Valley. Now see, when they can claim their frontier up till the Karakoram Valley, that means Aksai Chin should go to them, as well as this region, the Shaksgam Valley. That is how they grabbed the land, and it was Pakistan, Ayub Khan, who handed over this part on a platter to them, and this part We know it was a no man's land, but then in 1957, China started constructing its Highway 219, and from there, problems started. So, this area was also occupied by China. So, these are the problem areas that China has grabbed. This was the original frontier in the Xinjiang, and now it basically extended through fudging its maps and histories up till Karakoram, that is the Trans Himalayas. So Trans Himalayas are this Kunlun, Karakoram, Ladakh and Kailash range, right? Now getting back to it, China played insidious role in changing the frontiers of Jammu and Kashmir through fictitious claims and unscrupulous alliances with local chieftains. They exploited the great game between British India and Russia in late 19th century, and I've explained to you that this was basically to expand their horizons and their territories in Asia, and that was being played between British India and Russia, right? It pitched territorial claims far beyond the traditional frontiers of Xinjiang, that is the Kunlun Mountains. So from Xinjiang, they extended to Kunlun Mountains, and then from Kunlun Mountains to Tagdumbash, Pamirs and the Karakoram. So slowly, that is what they do. If you remember yesterday also we discussed how in Nepal, they changed the course of a stream and then they claim that area. So that is what they do for claiming lands. It gradually crept up in areas in Tangdumbash Pamirs and Karakoram, well south of its frontier along the Kunlun Mountains. By 1890s, started asserting its presence in the valleys between the Kunlun and the main Karakoram range I've just shown you. In 1869, the Mir of Hunza. Now there's a valley called Hunza. I'll give you a brief idea where it is, right? So the Hunza Valley lies somewhere here. This region is Hunza Valley, right? And you know now this is Gilgit-Baltistan, so Pakistan, and you see their CPEC is virtually running through this Hunza Valley. So the Mir of Hunza was defeated by joint forces of British and Raja. Then China started practice of exchanging gifts with the Mir, and then they made the retrospective claim on Hunza as a tributary to King Empire of 1962. See how they fudge their history, and they use this King Empire many times, right? Even for claiming Ladakh and Arunachal, they use these King Empire maps, all fake. Those people are fake. Contradicted by China's own historical accounts and maps of 18th and 19th centuries, which show the southwestern frontiers of China extending barely up to Kunlun range. So again, I've shown you Kunlun range was their natural frontier, and now they're fudging history. In 1891, China had quietly moved south of Kunlun range to consolidate their presence in Shahidullah, which earlier marked the furthest outpost of princely state of J&K. Then they moved further south of Suget and thereafter showed up at Karakoram Pass. So see, such land-hungry people they are. Then in 1936, the Mir of Hunza was asked by British to abandon his rights over the region, but Shaksgam Valley, it remained with the Mir of Hunza. And in 1947, India inherited this region, Shaksgam Valley, following J&K's accession in 1947. Again, let me show you. This was the original J&K, right? Then China took some part. Then this was the J&K that was there in 1947. Then Pakistan gave this region to China, right? This Shaksgam Valley. See, color coding. Traditional boundary claimed by former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. And these are illegally occupied territories. China occupied Kashmir, China occupied Kashmir, Pakistan occupied Kashmir. And this is a closer view of the Hunza Valley. See, it is in the Gilgit-Baltistan region, and from here it is the CPEC is also running. Now this place called Pamir Knot is very important. Before we move back, let me tell you something about Pamir Knot as well. When you'll be studying your geography, you'll get to know about plate tectonics, right? Then you'll get to know how Indian subcontinent was a plate that collided with the Eurasian plate, right? So the point at which it collided was the Pamir Knot, and from that knot, it is known as a point of inflection. Many mountain ranges emerged. Let me show you a map. So this is the Pamir, Karakoram, Himalaya, Kunlun, then Altintag, Tinshan, Altai, Hindu Kush. These are just the names. I'll show you the map as well. Just wait. So see, this is Pamir Knot, right? And from here, different mountain ranges: Kunlun, Karakoram, Himalayas, Tinshan, Hindu Kush, Suleiman. These all ranges are emerging from Pamir Knot, because when the plate, the Indian subcontinent plate collided with the Eurasian plate, then it was a point of inflection. It made a puncture there, and lot of igneous material came out, and that developed into many mountain ranges, right? So that is why It is Pamir Knot, very, very important, right? Now back to it. In 1953, Chinese troops actively started transgressing in the frontier in eastern Hunza, and by that time it was under Pakistan's control because Pakistan had invaded India through its tribesmen, right? And then our then Prime Minister went to the UN, then there was ceasefire, then the whole thing of POK. So this region was under POK. So they were basically having a tussle with the Pakistani authorities. In 1959, they rustled some livestock from the area, prompting the angry response from Pakistan that it was determined to defend its frontiers. But then, see, these people, they hate India so much that they are ready to let go of their own territory, their own identity, everything, just to show India down. So this person, Ayub Khan, spotting an opportunity in the rapidly deteriorating India-China ties in late 1950s, decided instead to pander to the Chinese, and he gave the Shaksgam Valley. So in 1963, Pakistan deliberately chose to downgrade the historical claims of Mir of Hunza and eventually signed away the Shaksgam Valley to China. Now, as per Article 6 of that agreement between the two, China is a party to the dispute of Shaksgam Valley. The map is decided by Article 2 of that agreement, and by Article 6, China has been made a party to the dispute. So this is the story of China occupied Kashmir, especially the Shaksgam Valley, right? So we've been discussing about all of these things. Gilgit-Baltistan, we've discussed 4 or 5 times, and today we discussed about the Shaksgam Valley. We also saw the maps, we saw the Pamir Knot, we saw the original JNK, and then we saw how China transgressed the region and how China is also occupying Kashmir, COK. Then this one again, do recent indicators hit at real economic revival? Now this is a dialogue between two people. Again, in our country, everybody is an expert. If you want, you can read this. Nothing substantial, just some points. For example, this question's CMIE data suggests that the unemployment rate rose again in October, while Manrega claims also rose in rural India. Can we expect employment to return to normalcy? So now they are saying that formal sector employment has been reasonably stable. The problem is with the serviced or the salaried employment in the retail or the service sector, right? Because they are losing their jobs, hospitality, retail, all those jobs where there is direct connect between people. We have seen very little in the way of support for stressed sectors by the government, which is unfortunately true. The only thing that we have seen is a program through the RBI for one-time restructuring of stressed firms, but that is not a support program. Then the government has said that it is open to another round of stimulus. What would be your wish list? Now, these are important points. They're sound financially. First, the government should pay its bills because government owes dues to state governments and public sector companies and other sectors. So if government pays its bills, what would happen? It would induce liquidity in those sectors, right? And that would help those sectors to get through this COVID and also revive their activity. Secondly, infrastructure is an investment. I've always been telling you, if you invest in infrastructure, it has a very big multiplier effect, right? It has impact on other sectors, right? And it is a long-term thing. You invest in infrastructure today and you'll be reaping benefits 10 years down the line. So that is what he's saying, that investment in infrastructure, which will not show up immediate activity on the ground, but is the most productive thing that we can do to trigger long-term growth. One way this can be spurred is by union government paying the states their GST dues upfront. Very, very good point. Because a lot of infrastructure projects are actually stagnant for the want of finances from state. And thirdly, investment in public health systems, which would require working very closely with the states. This is also very, very important. Unfortunately, this is neglected, but public health is very, very important. Because a healthy population can be a productive population, right? And if there are more health problems, more so we should be focusing on preventive care, right? Because if you have good preventive care, that means your medical bills would be less, your population in general is healthy, but the benefits will flow to the society in the long run. The costs are not so huge and receptiveness to doing something in this area is huge just now because we are suffering because of this rampant virus. So these are just the important points that I found in this. If you want, you can read the whole. Then the crucial expertise of CAPF. So this is about the Central Armed Police Forces and their role in relation to disaster management. Very good examples. You could use this as examples in your answer writing, because if you know your disaster management, there is a National Disaster Relief Force. So the CAPFs are an integral part of that force. And the other point is that CAPFs work independently of this force as well in their efforts for disaster relief. So when the disaster strikes, the government summons the Central Armed Police Forces to carry out the task of overcoming the disaster, not by only carrying out rescue and relief operations, but also mitigating the pains and problems arising of the disaster. Now, Central Armed Police Forces, they come under the control of Union Home Ministry, right? And they are basically paramilitary forces. And there are some Central Armed Police Forces, if you remember Assam Rifles, we discussed about them, right? That are under the dual control of Ministry of Home Affairs and Ministry of Defense, and that is creating problem. And your CAPFs is an important topic for your GS paper 3. So we are getting to know about their role in disaster management. So he's saying that when this corona, even before it started, ITBP had already set up a 600 bed quarantine center in Chawla on the outskirts of Delhi. Now when the passengers arrived, the first batch from Wuhan, 103 were quarantined at this center. Then the Director General of ITBP was given just 2 days to establish a 600 bed quarantine, and it was ready within the time. Then another 10,000 bed quarantine center was established in Chhatarpur in New Delhi by ITBP, and this is the largest quarantine center in the world. Now what relief measures they are taking? The expertise acquired by ITBP personnel and the standard operating procedure prepared by the ITBP came handy for the states and other police forces in establishing their own quarantine centers and COVID hospitals. Now CAPFs comprise of the Central Reserve Police Force, CRPF, BSF, CISF, Shasastra Seema Bal, SSB, Assam Rifles and ITBP, and they are all good forces, right? Assam Rifles, like I said, they have been in news because of the tussle between Ministry of Home Affairs and Ministry of Defense, right? Because Assam Rifles, for all practical purposes, they work with the army and they run on the run on the lines of the army, but their pension, salaries, allowances, emoluments, they are much lesser than the army, and that takes a toll on their morale. Now why that happens? Because their operational control is with the Ministry of Defense, and other control regarding their transfers, promotions, salaries, etc. comes under Ministry of Home Affairs. So this dual control creates problems for Assam Rifles. Though the NDRF has been actively involved in combating the spread of COVID-19, its services have not been adequately mentioned in the media. So NDRF is the National Disaster Relief Force, and it comprises of members coming from these CAPFs only. They go to the NDRF on deputation. It is mandated to carry out rescue and relief operations in disaster affected areas. The NDRF has been rendering human service not only in carrying out rescue and relief operations, but also in training the state disaster response forces personnel in all states. So you have this architecture where at top comes the NDRF, and then at state level there is the State Disaster Relief Force. Now along with its parent body, the National Disaster Management Authority, or the NDMA. Now if you talk about disaster management, so we have a 3-tier structure. At top is again NDMA, which is chaired by the Prime Minister of India. Then we have at the state level State Disaster Management Authority, and then you have District Disaster Management Authority. So along with its parent body, the National Disaster Management Authority, of which Prime Minister is the chairman, the NDRF has trained over 30,000 personnel in disaster management across the country. Far off corners, with 12 battalions of NDRF, each comprising of 1149 personnel spread across the country. Its experts have the core competency to tackle biological disasters like COVID-19. NDRF personnel are wholly drawn from the CAPFs. There is a good reserve of trained personnel who go back to their parent force after their stint with the specialized force is over. Such personnel can be deployed at quarantine centers for short-term courses. Now just some solutions, like there was a proposal by Niti Aayog last year that to make dentists eligible for MBBS degree. So he's saying that you could use that. And then in the end, he's saying that CAPFs have played a very important role in our country. So their versatile experience can be utilized for nation's advantage. Then page 10, UGC issues guidelines for reopening of colleges. Nothing related to your exam, but if you want, you could read this. Then this one is important. All insults not offense under SC/SC Act. So there is an SC/SC Act which is for the protection of people belonging to the SC/ST community, because unfortunately our society has been very unfair to them. So any casteist slur against any member belonging to the SC/ST community is a punishable offense, right? So now there have been, unfortunately, again, instances of fake cases under this SC/ST Act. There was a controversy regarding this. Supreme Court had nullified the criminal part. Then the government came out with an ordinance to overrule that, right? So that was in the past. Now there was some case against somebody accused of making offensive remarks against a member belonging to SC/ST community. Now the Supreme Court says that if the insult is not involving a caste angle, then it would be handled in normal laws, not under this act. That is what the Supreme Court has said. So all insults or intimidations to persons belonging to Dalit or tribal communities will not be an offense under the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act, says the Supreme Court. An offense is made out under the statute only if such an insult or intimidation is on account of victim belonging to Scheduled Caste or Scheduled Tribe. So only if it is a caste slur, then you can try the accused under this act. Otherwise, it could be a normal parlance of fight between two people. And if there is no caste slur, then you don't need to invoke this act. The court said the insult should be specifically intended to humiliate the victim for his. The object of the act is to punish violators who inflict indignities, humiliations, and harassments. So this is about this one. Then India slams Pakistan's decision on Kartarpur. So Pakistan, again, anything can happen. So basically what they did, they changed the management from the Pakistan Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee to an administrative control of an evacuee trustee property board, which is a non-Sikh body. So this is a problem, right? And we all know, we all saw what happened at Kartarpur, how the dome came off and the sham that they built there. Despicable people. Then army chief holds discussion in Nepal. So if you remember, I've been telling you, even yesterday I told you that there is a tradition between Indian army and the Nepal army, right? Because we have very close relations. Many Gurkhas are serving under the Indian army, right? So we have very warm and close relations. So under those relations, we give each chief of army the honorary rank of general, right? So now our chief of army got the honorary rank of general of Nepali army. Similarly, last year we bestowed this honor on the chief of Nepali army. So he held discussions with his Nepalese counterpart, General Purna Chandra Thapa in Kathmandu. Naravne was accorded a special guard of honor and was conferred the honorary rank of general of the Nepali army. Now Nepal is home to a large number of Gurkha soldiers of the Indian army, and the two militaries have maintained warm fraternal ties that remain undisturbed by bilateral politics, ups and down. General Naravne was honored in special event at Nepalese president's official residence, Sheetal Niwas. Then page 13, all about US elections. Then voter fraud claims baseless, says OSCE. So OSCE is a body of observers which check or oversee elections, right? So they have said that there is no fraud. So the team of international observers has described US President Donald Trump's claims of voter fraud as baseless allegations, asserting that such remarks harm public trust in democratic institutions. The observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, of which the United States is a member, said in a preliminary report. The general elections were competitive and well managed despite legal uncertainties and logistical challenges. The report said uncertainty caused by late legal challenges and evidence deficient claim about election fraud created confusion and concern among election officials and voters. Then you see China bars travelers from India and UK. So after it gave the Wuhan virus to the world, now it is banning travelers from India and UK so that they don't carry back that virus to the home country. Then Russia taking a dig, shortcomings in US election system, says Russia. Then this one, news analysis, win or lose, Trump will remain a powerful and disruptive force. Now this is more of a political article. I will discuss it with you, but there's not much of relevance as per your examination. Probably if you're writing this year mains, probably, but not a very high probability. So Trump loses his bid for re-election. It would be the first defeat of an incumbent president in the 29 years. He has been trying to discredit the election based on invented fraud claims, hoping either to hang on to power or explain away a loss. At the very least, he has 76 days left in office to use his power as he sees fit and to seek revenge on some of his perceived adversaries. So it's not over yet, right? Angry at defeat, he may fire or sideline a variety of senior officials who failed to carry out his wishes as he saw it, including Christopher Wray, the FBI director, and Dr. Anthony Fauci. Now, Trump has special dislike for Mr. Fauci, the government's top infectious disease specialist in the middle of the pandemic, and he even indicated at a rally recently that after the election he will be taking a call on Mr. Fauci. Now, more resilient, see the astonishing figures, because people were claiming that there would be a landslide victory for Biden. That did not happen. Then they would be saying that Trump would lose his vote share, but he has actually increased it, especially among the Black and Latino communities. So this is something really perplexing. So he received at least 68 million votes, or 5 million more votes than he did in 2016, and commanded about 48% of the popular vote, meaning he retained the support of nearly half of the public despite 4 years of scandal, setbacks, and whatever happened in that country. So that gives him a very great power that other defeated one-term presidents like Jimmy Carter and George Bush have not played. And as a matter of fact, he has huge amount of data about his voter base, and that data makes him very important person. We could see in future, if he loses eventually, that he would become a de facto leader of the Republican Party, and we would see some system like we have in India, that you go to elder leaders or senior leaders to seek their blessing. So many candidates would be seeking Mr. Trump's blessings, and he would be calling the shots. Even while remaining outside of the White House or the government, he would be calling shots through his stooges within the Senate and Congress. So his 88 million strong Twitter following gives him a bullhorn to be an influential voice on the right, potentially making him a kingmaker among rising Republicans. Until a new generation of Republicans step forward, Mr. Trump could position himself as a de facto leader of the party, wielding an extraordinary database of information about his supporters that future candidates would love to rent or otherwise access. So that is the importance, and that is why I always say that 21st century data is power, right? And that is why we are also going for our data protection bill. We discussed yesterday data localization. So having data is very, very important. President Trump also has the largest amount of data ever collected by a politician. This will impact races and policies for years to come. Now, Mr. Trump enjoyed strong support within his own party, winning 93% of Republican votes. He also did somewhat better with Black voters 12% and Hispanic voters 32% than he did 4 years ago, despite his often racist rhetoric. So see, even despite all of that, he is increasing his vote share among these communities. And after his high energy blitz across battleground states, late deciding voters broke his way. Despite the coronavirus pandemic and the related economic toll, 41% of voters said they were doing better than when he took office, compared with only 20% who described themselves as worse off. So he's again making a case for himself. Even if he has to vacate office, throughout his life he'll be ranting that it was an election fraud, election fraud, election fraud. So he's playing very smart there. And despite not being the president of the US, he would still wield much influence on the US society, because like the world, that society has also become polarized, and he has his set of followers, and almost 50% of the country follows or wants Mr. Trump. So that is a very dangerous thing in years to come for the US. Then page 14, GST Rajasthan agrees to go with option 1. So Rajasthan is a Congress ruled state, and all the Congress ruled states were against the option of borrowing, but now they have chosen that option, Rajasthan, and they would go for borrowing, under which center borrows and then transfer that money in tranches to the states, right? So already 16 states and 3 UTs had joined. Now Rajasthan has also joined. So Rajasthan has accepted the center's borrowing proposal to meet the GST revenue shortfall and will get more than 4,600 crore through the special window. And in addition, it would also get the permission to raise additional 5,462 crores. Then this one, pandemic themed cyber attacks rose in Q2. This is important for your paper 3, GS3, for cyber security. So cyber criminals are also evolving. Now they are attacking their victims through using coronavirus advisories or warnings or information, and through that they are basically exploiting the vulnerabilities in the system. So cyber criminals took advantage of COVID-19, adjusting their cybercrime campaigns to lure victims with pandemic related themes and exploiting people working from home. According to a study, consequently, the second quarter of the calendar year 2020 saw cyber attack detections, mostly pandemic themed intrusions, rise 605% over the previous quarter. This was a report of McAfee, which is a device to cloud cyber security firm. Now starting with the Indian Express. Government plans Metro Neo for low cost ride in suburbs and smaller cities. Very, very important. Paper 3, infrastructure. So let us see what it is. So this is what the Metro Neo is going to be. It will be AC electric coaches with rubber tires, but still they will be drawing power from overhead traction. So it would be something like this. This is just for representation purpose, but the tires would be rubber ones like we have in buses and cars. They would be running on elevated tracks. They would be having smaller stations, coaches with automatic door closing and passenger information system. And the main advantage of such a track is that their cost is 75% to 80% cheaper than the normal metro rail. So this would be catering to small cities or cities having population less than 10 lakh. Now there's also a thing called Metro Light, and its cost is about 40 to 60% or 40 to 50% than the normal metro. Now these have AC coach trains and they run on dedicated rail corridors on surface. Tracks can be fenced to draw power. Again, it is based on electric traction. And they have shelter platforms, but no platform screen doors, AFC gates, X-ray and baggage scanner because of low cost, right? Ticket validators are inside the trains, and trains to get priority clearance at traffic junction. So they will be running on the surface, and Metro Light on the elevated surface. Metro Neo on elevated surface, Metro Light on surface and subsurface, right? So the government is set to approve national standard specifications for Metro Neo, a no-frills, low-cost urban rail transit system aimed at cities with population less than 10 lakh or suburbs of bigger cities. For example, you have Delhi, then you have Noida. So in Noida, you could be having this Metro Neo. The approval paves the way for state governments and urban local bodies to design proposals as per the requirements. They would be running on rubber tires like we discussed, but drawing traction power from overhead wires. Metro Neo systems are lighter and smaller than conventional metro rails, with a 10-10 axle load instead of normal 17 tons. Cost about 25% less of conventional systems, but with similar facilities, and is cheaper than other budget option Metro Light, which costs about 40 to 60% of normal metro. Now cities like Maharashtra Nasik and Telangana's Warangal have pitched for Metro Neo system, and in the next 5 years, around 910 kilometers of metro projects of various kinds are proposed to be built across the country, and that would make the total of metro projects in our country about 1600 kilometers. Now this is about the Metro Light, how this will work. So this is again an infographic. You can read it in your own leisure time. The notes would be available, or you can take a screenshot. Now moving on. Haryana House clears bill to reserve 75% private sector jobs for locals. So this will be applicable only for private sector jobs where salary is up to rupees 50,000. In such a project, 70% of the jobs would be reserved for locals, and out of those 75%, the company can make provisions for district-wise allocation as well, right? But overall it should be 75, then district-wide allocation or reservation can also be provided, right? This is all about it. You can read it, nothing rocket science. Then Rajnath on China talks eve. For peace, need ability to deter war. So it is very, very important to have such a stand, because you can talk to China only from a position of strength. The day you cower down, they will not leave you, right? So a very good strategy by India. Then again on data protection bill, yesterday we discussed about Reliance, right? RCom, and today it is Ola and Uber. They were also called, and they say that they are supporting data localization. Now some unique points about their apps and how they possibly exploit our situation, right? So let us see. So cab aggregators Ola and Uber appeared before the Joint Parliamentary Committee and were questioned about their investment pattern, business model, the safety and security of data of their users, surge pricing and fairness of their algorithm. Members of the panel asked whether rates between iPhone users and Android users for the same distance and sought details regarding search pricing. So you see, they could be even varying the prices based on the device that you use for the same distance. Such sophisticated things they use to basically alter prices. Whether location, time, gender, and the battery left on the phone play an important role in determining the prices. Again, see, this is a scary prospect that if you're a woman and you're booking a cab after 10 p.m., then they would be charging you higher. And especially if you're booking from an unsafe area, then they would charge even more. So see, this is just exploitation of the consumer. The representatives of both the companies said they support localization of data. They were asked about their company's investment pattern and business model in other countries where they operate. Specific questions were asked regarding data mining and privacy of the data, given the fact that several countries where they operate already have data protection laws. They were asked how they protect the interest of customers regarding personal data. Representatives of both sought certain changes in the present bill to make it easier and understandable, and also said that there should not be any gray areas leaving the Data Protection Authority, the setting up of which is envisaged in the bill to interpret and take decisions. So now from here, the most important point and the scary prospect to take away is that your device, your gender, your battery percentage, the time at which you book the cab, and the location from which you book the cab, these companies could be exploiting all those factors to give you a fare, right? Again, imagine being a woman stuck in an isolated spot, booking the cab after 10 p.m. using an iPhone, right? And you are charged 2 times the normal fare because you are in a vulnerable position. So this is how these tech companies are basically swindling us. Then Nepal confers honorary rank on army chief. We've already discussed. This tradition of each country bestowing the honorary title on the army chief of the other goes back decades. Commander-in-Chief General K.M. Kariyappa was the first Indian Army Chief to be decorated with this title in 1950. Now it is also telling us about the Lipu Lake dispute. The row arose after India inaugurated the road from Dharchula to Lipu Lake Pass. I've discussed this near the India, Nepal and China tri-junction, cutting short the distance to Kailash Mansarovar. Nepal objected to the road and issued a map that showed Lipu Lake within Nepal. But in mid-May, General Naravne said that he was not sure what Nepal was agitating about, as the road constructed by India was west of the Kali River and as per the Treaty of Sagauli that belongs to us, which serves as the border between the two nations. Then we've already discussed India slams Pak transfer of Kartarpur Sahib management to non-Sikh body. Then this one also we have discussed, top court offense under SCST Act only if intention is to humiliate. Then this one, ban use of disinfection tunnels, UV rays, says Supreme Court. So basically center has not come out with any SOPs or any guidelines. It has just issued an advisory till now about the use of such methods, and they can have deleterious effects on the human body, and some organizations, including some government organizations, are using them indiscriminately. So there has been a petition. Now Supreme Court is telling the center, either you come out with some guidelines or you ban this, right? Then India's resolution on counter-terror adopted by UN General Assembly. So India had brought out a resolution against the state-sponsored cross-border terrorism, right? So this was adopted. It was supported by more than 75 countries and it has been adopted. Now India's call for strengthening national measures to address this issue at the General Assembly also predates the adoption of Resolution 1540. So what is the resolution? 1540, right? What does it deal with? By the Security Council, which obligates all states to refrain from supporting any means of non-state actors from developing, acquiring, manufacturing, possessing, transporting, transferring, or using nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons and their means of delivery, right? So India's latest resolution, supported by 75 countries, adopted by the Committee of UN General Assembly, and there is also resolution 1540. This is against the state-sponsored terrorism, right? Cross-border terrorism, and we are victims of that. Then important news, Travancore Temple Board decides to appoint ST priest. So this temple board had already appointed SC priests, right, way back in 2018, and now it has adopted or it has appointed ST priests, and it basically does so under government policy. There are proper recruitment exams, and then there is also reservation policy like in any other recruitment exam. That is what it is telling. So the Travancore Devasthanam board has decided to appoint a person from the scheduled tribe community as a part-time temple priest. This time that the temple board, which is under the state government, will appoint a person for the ST community as a priest. So this is the first. In 2018, it appointed 5 SC priests in temple under its control. The entry of Dalit priests into the sanctum sanctorium was facilitated by TDB's decision to select priests as per recruitment process followed in government posts, including meeting reservation norms. So a good sign of change in the social moods of the country. Then this editorial, very, very good editorial. I'll give you broad contours about it. Then you can read it, but you must read this one, right? So this editorial is talking about the role of moderate Muslims, how they provide a lip service to all this Islamic radicalism, and in a way they are basically enabling this radicalization. This is by Mr. Javed Anand. He is the president of Indian Muslims for Secular Democracy. He begins by telling that whenever there is some attack, some radical terror attack by Islamist radicals, then the moderate Muslims, firstly they'll curiously condemn it, then they'll quickly rush to absolve Islam of any blame. They will quote certain verses from Quran and some ahadith or hadiths to affirm that Islam means peace. But the problem is that the extremist Islamic terrorists, they also quote the same Quran and the same hadith, right? So Islam means peace chant offers no solution because it fails to address the recurring problem that why so much of violence, especially from Islamic community, right? Now, quote some study by Reza Aslan, you can read it. So she says that Islam, like any other religion, is what the followers make of it. So religion is what people do. So how people interpret it, how they go about it really makes a difference. Gives a very good example that both Gandhi and Godse took inspiration from Bhagavad Gita, but they interpreted the whole thing in different ways. Then he talks about that the moderate Muslims should get a reality check rather than fighting about what is true or real Islam. They should accept that there are many livid forms of Islams in the world, right? And because they don't do so, they become Islamist apologists seeking refuge in whataboutery, searching for root causes in everywhere except his religion. And this is a very true or pertinent thing, and this has to change. Western hypocrisy and double standards and asking what he believes to be the mother of all questions. Is there no limit to freedom of expression? What if someone insults your father? So these are the kind of arguments that are made. So on the face of it, you're trying to come across as someone moderate, someone liberal, but deep down inside, you are just basically supporting the terror attacks. Now talking about whataboutery, when they are asked, then they say that there are people, Buddhists are killing other people in Sri Lanka, right? But Buddhists in Sri Lanka nor in Myanmar, they don't kill anyone in the name of Buddha. There the problems are different. So he's talking about then this root cause phenomena that many Muslims, they look for root cause in geopolitics, colonialism, neo-colonialism, etc. They look everywhere except religion. So they'll blame everyone and everyone, but they won't accept the blame that there has been a problem in misinterpretation. Again, he quotes someone. He says, if your first reaction to the vile Islamo-fascist terror attacks is through the violent and racist history of French colonialism and post-colonialism, etc., then you are ethically bankrupt. Very, very important point she's making, right? See, this is the problem. No community is bad. People are not bad. There are some sections who do these things and they bring disrepute to the whole community, to the whole religion. And then there are others who, on the face of it, they pretend to be liberals, moderates, but actually they stand exposed because of their actions. Now, limits to freedom of expression line. This is again one more sort of excuse that is given. The moderate Muslim in his element, exposing the link between the contentious cartoons of Prophet Muhammad today and the historical hostility of Christian West towards Islam and its prophets. You remember I told you how Erdogan is claiming that the West is trying to revive the crusades against the Muslims. So that is the kind of stupid arguments these people give. The cartoons, we are told, are part of sustained insidious propaganda to incite hatred for the Prophet and fuel Islamophobia in the guise of free speech. Also exposes the hypocrisy and double standards of West in the selective exercise of free speech vis-a-vis Muslims. To this, one is tempted to respond, look who is talking. Very important points this person is making. right? And he is someone from the Islamic community itself. France, like most European laws, has hate crimes such as racism and xenophobia, which includes anti-religious hate crimes. Surprise, surprise. He's telling those people. France even has hate speech laws. Those laws protect individuals and groups from being defamed or insulted because they do not belong to or they belong to, in fact or in fancy, to an ethnicity, a nation, a race, sex, religion, etc. Right? The laws forbid any communication which is intended to incite discrimination against, hatred of, or harm to anyone. So this is what he's saying. Now, very important points that he's making here, that even France sets limits on the freedom of expression, but there the basic principle is this: ideas do not have rights, people do. Very, very important. So I cannot abuse your parents because those are real people, but things like gods, goddesses, prophets, they fall in the realm of ideas in the French definition. So there is no defamation against those things. This is as per the French laws, and they're right in their own domain, right? This is because universally the freedom of expression is believed to be meaningless without the right to offend. Very, very important. That is the case. For the French, the right to offend includes not only the right to express doubt, question, criticize, ridicule, mock, and provoke, but also the right to insult and outrage. Did not Prophet Muhammad greatly offend people of his own clan tribe by saying things which they considered to be highly blasphemous? So there would always be some form of offending going around in the world. Not just you, moderate Muslims, many in the West also consider Prophet cartoons as highly offensive and in bad taste. Certain heads of state, like that joker Imran Khan and that joker Erdogan, they have been, and Mahathir, ex-head of state of Malaysia, they are actually inciting people to commit murders. And in madrasas in Pakistan, teachers are teaching children how to decapitate someone, how to behead someone. So this is the kind of education that they're giving children. Now, children are not born in a religion or they don't have hatred. But when you teach them, that is who they grow into, right? So very, very important. I've given you broad contour. You can read it. Exceptional article. Then this one, body mass index of Indian 19 years old among the lowest in 200 countries. So this study is again by the Lancet and it will be published. So where the 19-year-old girls and boys have low body mass index, right? Now what is BMI? It is measured as the weight in kilograms divided by square of height in meters. The WHO guidelines define a normal BMI range as 18.5 to 24.9, overweight as 25 or higher, and obesity as 30 or higher. Now he's also talking about the height difference, that a 20 centimeter or higher difference between countries with the tallest and shortest mean height represents approximately 8 years of growth gap. So this basically represents a growth gap, and they are telling that overall people have grown taller, but then the gaps are stark between some countries. For example, 19-year-old girls in India have the same mean height as 12-year-old Dutch girls. So this is the difference in their development. Then the analysis charts child and adolescent physical growth trends over 35 years. Both height and BMI have increased from 1985 to 2019, although there is still a great deal of potential for height while curbing many future rise in obesity. So programs targeted towards poor from birth through school years are needed. Now in developing countries like India, we have a dual burden, that is overnutrition and undernutrition. So some sections are having undernutrition, others are overnutrition. The prevalence of overweight and obesity among adolescents of both Indian girls and boys is lower when compared to children of developed nations. The reason could be several, like variations in the epigenetic, dietary intakes, familial, psychosocial, parental education, occupation, income, etc. So this is about this Lancet report, BMI among the lowest, and height is also low. In female hunter burial, lessons in gender roles. So they basically found that a 9,000-year-old grave, it was of a hunter, and that hunter was a female. Then these scientists, they collected data and they analyzed other graves, and this is about Americas, right? So from analysis of burial records for a similar period in Americas, they concluded that as many as 30 to 50% of hunters in these populations were female, based on the fact that these burials, bodies were found with weapons, which was the hallmark of hunters. So this basically questions the idea that we have as of now, that it is generally believed or taught in many subjects like anthropology, sociology, and in general parlance, that women were gatherers and men were hunters, and that somewhat carried on to the present times as well, right? But this discovery is challenging those ideas, and it is telling that for the majority of our human history, we were not modern but hunters and gatherers, and for that major period of our history, there was equality among men and women in terms of their role as well as status. So this is what this is saying. You can read this. Then page 13, The World, just the headline: after attack, Austria plans overhaul of its intelligence agency. Then again a news from Pakistan: Pak bank manager killed by security guard over blasphemy allegations. So see, this is what is the problem. Then Trump's claims about fraud harmed poll processes, election observers say. We have discussed this, right? Then Norway Supreme Court hears challenge to oil drilling in Arctic. Now this has been touted as Norway's case of the century. Now the thing is that the Norwegian constitution declares that all citizens have the right to healthy environment, right? But Norway is also one of the largest oil exporters, and the major source of income for Norway comes from oil export, right? Oil and gas exports. So in effect, what is happening, that in their own country, they are using green technologies, but they are exporting these fossil fuels, and these fossil fuels are being used throughout the world. So in the end, they are producing pollution, not in Norway, but some other places. And we know that global warming is not a localized effect. It is a global thing. Whether you burn a fuel in Norway or you burn fuel in India, eventually everybody is going to get caught up into that. So a group of environmentalists have now challenged this in the Supreme Court, saying that this practice should be stopped because we have the right of clean environment, right? Our constitution covers environmental provisions, so this practice should be stopped altogether. But if it happens, it will cripple the Norwegian economy because that is how they earn the money. Then again, we've discussed how these first world environmentalists, they don't get any traction within their own countries. Now here also they'll lose for sure, and then they'll again come to countries like India and preach us about something. So the Norwegian constitution declares all citizens have the right to healthy environment, but Norway's economy is built around oil and gas industry that accounts for more than half of the national exports. Now the country's Supreme Court is being asked to confront this apparent paradox as it hears a challenge by environmental groups seeking to invalidate license for new exploration in Arctic on constitutional grounds. So this is a very curious case. This is the first climate change litigation to be brought under Constitution's environmental provisions, which were passed in 2014. It is also among the highest profile cases in a series of climate change lawsuits brought by activists in Europe and elsewhere, one that Norwegian news outlets have described as the news of the century. So why are they saying this? The lawsuit is pertinent because of Norway's position on the forefront of the international race for oil in the Arctic. So Norway is making headways in there because of more money potential, even as it has implemented ambitious emissions and reduction goals. It will also raise questions such as whether Norway is responsible for emissions burned from its exports, which are far greater than its domestic emissions. So this is an ethical question as well. A victory for the environmental groups could force Norway to phase out activities like oil exploration, a cornerstone of its economy. A major cause of climate change is burning of oil and gas. We all know that. Now the Norwegian government has said that it fulfilled its constitutional duty by compensating for negative effects on the environment in other countries. This is known as offsetting, right? So what happens? To basically offset their own emissions, they finance green projects in developing countries, and from that they earn carbon credits, and those carbon credits, they basically offset their own emissions, right? We've discussed this when we discussed CCS. And that an expansive interpretation of the Constitution's environmental provisions would change the relationship between state power in a fundamental manner and potentially erode democracy. So this is about this case of the century that is going to happen in Norway. Now this one, WhatsApp gets NPCI not to go live on UPI, will be able to serve 20 million of its users. So basically NPCI is the National Payments Corporation of India, which is the regulator for all the digital payments, right? So now NPCI has given it the go ahead, but still it has to get the green light from the RBI. Once it gets that, then you would be able to transfer money through UPI on the WhatsApp as well. But NPCI has also come out with new rules which says that on any platform which is enabling UPI payments, the total payments that can be enabled through UPI would be just 30% of the payments happening on that platform. So for example, you're using Paytm. So if the overall payments on Paytm are rupees 100, then only 30 rupees payment could be happening through UPI. Rest would be through the wallet and other mechanisms. And this provision, companies have been given time till 2023 to comply with the norms, right? Then for added security, WhatsApp rolls out disappearing messages. So just like Snapchat, your message, they disappear automatically after some time. On WhatsApp, they will initially start with a week's time, and then they are saying that slowly they'll bring down that time. So whatever message you send on this platform, they will automatically delete, including the texts and the images and audio or whatever media files you are sharing. Then we've already discussed Rajasthan picks option 1 to meet GST shortfall. So folks, that is all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel. Also press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos, and please give us a thumbs up if you liked our videos. Also connect with us on our Instagram page UPSC for everyone, and please connect with us on our Telegram page where you can access the PDFs of the videos that I'll be posting daily, right? So see you next time. Till then, stay happy, stay safe, and have a great day. Namaste and Jai Hind.